4 weeks ago, an ITV documentary broadcast allegations that one of this country's best-known TV stars, a man of the people, a friend of royalty, a devout Catholic who comforted the sick, was a child abuser. And he'd been allowed to get away with it unchecked for 50 years.
How did one man con the entire society?
Since being exposed, more than 200 people have claimed they were Savile's victims. Now, finally, their stories are being heard.
It is a bloody tragedy that this has happened when he's died. All this should have come out way before his death. But these girls are left with that legacy, and who's going to pay for that?
The NHS, the Home Office and local authorities may all face legal action for failing to protect Savile's many young victims.
It's growing by the minute. Initially it was a few and now they're coming in all the time and they're from the variety of different organisations.
But no organisation is under more fire than the one that made Jimmy Savile a star, the BBC.
Jimmy Savile's victims have faced years of pain. We owe it to them and to our audiences to understand how this could have happened and to make sure that everything we do ensures that nothing like this could ever happen again.
This is the worst crisis that I can remember in my nearly 50 years at the BBC.
Tonight, Panorama asks just how much BBC staff really knew about Savile's abuse.
After they had gone, he indicated to me in a nudge-nudge, wink-wink sort of way that he had just had sex with them. I didn't believe him.
And reveals the inside story of why a BBC investigation that could have exposed Savile almost a year ago was spiked instead.
We weren't asked to find more evidence or anything like that. We weren't asked to get more people on camera. We were told to stop working on the story.
It raises questions for the very top of the corporation.
You know, ever since the decision was taken to shelve our story, I've not been happy with public statements made by the BBC. I think they're very misleading about the nature of the investigation we were doing.
That's me. It's the only surviving photograph of me that I know of.
On November the 14th last year, Karen Ward did an interview with the BBC's Newsnight programme. In doing so, she became the first person to talk on camera about being abused by Jimmy Savile.
He wanted me to do things for him. He wanted me to fondle him. He asked me for oral sex, and I didn't want to. And he promised me that if I gave him oral sex, that he would arrange for me and my friends to go to Television Centre and be on his television show.
This interview has never been broadcast by the BBC before.
Well, I was 14. Of course I wanted to go to Television Centre. I didn't want to give him oral sex because I thought it was disgusting, but I did it.
Off camera, the investigation team had managed to speak to 4 more women who said that as girls, they too had been sexually abused by Jimmy Savile. Karen was ill with cancer when she filmed her interview with Liz McKean.
It was a very big step for her, but she'd obviously steeled herself to do it. And the thing that motivated her was that she was so angry at everything that was being devoted to holding Jimmy Savile up as this wonderful figure, and she'd known what had happened to her, she'd known what had happened to a lot of other girls.
Karen's interview contained serious allegations, not just about Savile, but of abuse on BBC premises by other celebrities. Again, this was backed up off camera by others.
Okay. Gary Glitter was one example. He was particularly horrible and only interested in getting as much sex as he could possibly get from any girl. I can remember seeing him having sex with one of the girls from Duncroft in Jimmy Savile's dressing room, which was packed with lots of people.
Was Jimmy Savile there?
Yeah.
He'd have known what was going on.
Oh yes, he laughed about it. He thought it was funny.
But the BBC chose not to reveal what Karen had to say. The investigation was dropped for what the corporation says were editorial reasons. Instead, just a few weeks later, the BBC broadcast this.
Let's pay tribute to the extraordinary, unique, and never ever to be forgotten host, the one and only Sir Jimmy Savile.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, all you guys and girls. Welcome indeed to Jim'll Fix It. Now then.
This special Jim'll Fix It tribute, put out on Boxing Day, attracted 5 million viewers.
This, in all truthfulness, is just a fraction of the mail that we get.
There was also a Radio 2 eulogy, followed shortly after by 2 more BBC TV tributes.
He was a pop pioneer.
And how about that then?
Some of Savile's former colleagues knew there was another side that wasn't being shown.
It was pretty vomit-inducing that the BBC was running tributes to Jimmy Savile when he had died, and I could only marvel that the programme-making decisions were obviously in the hands of a younger generation who didn't really understand the severity of what had happened.
To me, it just meant that, yet again, I hadn't been believed. But I've spent my whole life not being believed.
Today, Karen Ward, now recovering from surgery to remove her cancer, still feels angry about the decision to drop the Newsnight investigation.
It was hurtful and it was difficult because I had been pushed so hard to do it when I didn't want to. You have to remember, I wasn't very well at all. I had cancer. In the end, I said, OK. And for all that stress, that's what made me angry. The fact that I'd gone through all that stress when I really needed to concentrate on getting well. And then they never used it because somebody higher up didn't believe me.
Newsnight's decision to drop the investigation was called into question by a few newspapers soon after. But the whole issue really exploded into controversy just weeks ago when ITV chose to run the story the BBC had shelved. The documentary built on key evidence originally gathered by Newsnight. Savile's abuse victims were finally given a voice on ITV. The reporter was Mark Williams-Thomas, a former police officer who'd previously been involved in the dropped Newsnight investigation.
He'd had a big background in child protection, and we were using him really as an expert witness to just evaluate the testimonies that we had. And certainly he had seen everything we had, and he thought it was very strong.
When exposure was broadcast, the impact was immediate. It engulfed local authorities, the NHS, the Home Office, but especially the BBC.
And what has deepened the revulsion is that this happened at the BBC, an institution so loved and trusted it's known as Auntie. This has cast a stain on the BBC.
As new victims came forward, the corporation was accused of turning a blind eye and covering up Savile's abuse, both now and in the past.
These are serious issues, really serious, for which the Director General...
9 days after ITV's film, the BBC's Director General announced 2 inquiries. One into Savile's behaviour at the BBC over 4 decades, the other whether there were any management failings in the canning of Newsnight's Savile investigation.
Despite our efforts to make clear our belief that the decision to drop the Newsnight investigation was taken properly, for sound editorial reasons, people have continued to speculate. This is damaging to the BBC and is a cloud of suspicion which cannot be allowed to continue.
I think there are serious questions about the handling of this matter recently, and particularly the fact that Newsnight appeared to be uncovering evidence to suggest that this was happening, and yet that it was decided not to pursue that report.
I only knew that there was a Newsnight investigation. I didn't have any details about it.
The dropping of the Newsnight investigation has also raised doubts over the leadership of the new BBC Director General, George Entwistle.
You're happy with your role in this, are you?
I'm entirely convinced that I've done all the right things, yeah.
The allegation here, or the charge here, is not that a bad editorial decision was made. The charge is that a film that was ready to go, I don't believe that's the case, was pulled, killed, completely eradicated because of pressure from the top on account of the Savile tributes. Now, that's the allegation, and that, as far as I can establish, is simply not true.
The unmasking of one of Britain's most prolific sexual offenders begins here in Surrey. In the 1970s, Duncroft was a Home Office-approved school for girls.
It was a very strange place, and it was filled with celebrities coming along, film stars, all sorts of people, minor royalty, very, very strange.
Newsnight producer Myrian Jones visited regularly as a child. His aunt was the head. Another regular visitor, often driving his Rolls-Royce convertible, was Jimmy Savile.
On one occasion I saw him taking out some of the girls, and my parents would question with my aunt whether this was really appropriate.
Did you think it was unusual?
Everything about that place seemed very odd to me. It was sort of later on, I suppose, that I started to wonder whether there was something else going on.
All the girls at Duncroft were deemed to be emotionally disturbed. For some, at first, Savile seemed almost like a saviour.
Jimmy Savile would turn up and suddenly brighten or give the impression that he was going to change something for you. He was going to give you hope. You know, you were worth something because this famous guy would come and see you.
But it became clear what Savile's intentions actually were: sexual abuse.
After a while, the girls would wonder why he bothered coming. And then, of course, everybody knew why he would come, because he would be leching after all these pretty young girls who were so vulnerable.
Karen Ward was one of those. Savile would take her and others out in his car and abuse them. It has haunted Karen ever since.
I'm so full of self-disgust, I can't believe that I did such things. I can't believe that I allowed such things to happen, that I didn't immediately rush and scream it from the rooftops. Make this stop. Just make it stop. But I didn't. None of us did. I just carried on. Lulled into a kind of false sense of that's how these things have to be. That's what we're for.
It was only when Savile died at the age of 84 that his past would finally start to catch up with him. Newsnight producer Myrian Jones went straight to his editor with the idea.
Jimmy Savile died on the 29th of October, a Saturday. I pitched it on the Monday morning. The victims, as far as we could tell, would be very vulnerable, people who would not stand up in a libel court. So it was only when he died that it really became feasible.
Myrian had already seen that Karen Ward had published on the internet an account of sexual abuse at Duncroft by a man called J.S. He contacted Karen and she agreed to be interviewed. The team tracked down other women who said they had been abused by Savile when they were at Duncroft.
We'd found Karen Ward very credible, but that interview on its own was not going to make this story. And it was the collection of testimonies from the other women as well, those who didn't want to go on the record, but were very happy for us to use quotes and gave us detailed quotes of their experiences. They were all telling the same story.
Newsnight's investigation gathered pace. But how could Savile's abuse have remained hidden while he was still alive?
This horror, for that is what it was, took place while all of society was watching. But because it was off the scale of everybody's belief system, they didn't really come to terms with it.
Jimmy Savile's larger-than-life story started in Leeds in 1926. He was a miner during the war, a pro wrestler, a semi-pro cyclist. He drove the Savile brand to stardom on the back of rock and roll. In the dance halls of the 1950s and 60s, Savile's predatory behaviour appeared to be well known.
One person said the big joke with Jimmy Savile was that he was either going to be famous or he was going to be locked up for having sex with 14-year-old girls.
After Savile died, biographer Dan Davis tracked down those who knew about the early abuse.
He had a reputation as somebody who preferred girls at the younger end of the spectrum. And other people I've spoken to have confirmed that the younger the better was his motto when it came to women.
So there were obviously a trail of people who knew about this 50, 40, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Welcome to January the 1st, 1964.
Savile's link with the BBC began when he joined Top of the Pops in 1964. His Radio 1 career started 4 years later.
I arrived at Radio 1 September 30th, 1973. By the time I arrived, he had transcended us all. Without a doubt, there were stars like Tony Blackburn. There were influential people like John Peel, who was the most important man in popular music in the world for about a dozen years. But in terms of stardom, it was Jimmy.
Jimmy Savile!
By the early 1970s, the BBC was filming Jimmy Savile as he crisscrossed the country on a series of charity runs and walks. And he always had at his disposal a camper van, or just a Range Rover with a mattress in the back. The BBC's nationwide programme caught up with him on the shores of Loch Ness as Savile searched for the monster.
Have you seriously seen anything of any interest out there?
Yes, she was about 17 and she had long legs and long blonde hair, but she wasn't a monster.
Savile was pursued by fans everywhere he went.
You lurker! Come here!
Nationwide reporter Martin Young joined him on another run from Carlisle to Newcastle.
I think in a sense it was the beginnings of celebrity culture. Jimmy could have who he wanted. Jimmy appeared to just pluck one from the masses.
Good morning, Jimmy.
Good morning, my friend Martin. How are you?
How are you feeling?
Martin found Savile in his camper van, lying on the bed with a teenage girl. They were both fully clothed, but for the reporter, it confirmed the rumours he'd heard were true.
I thought he was a pervert.
Even that?
Yeah.
Did you think about reporting it or anything like that?
No, never even crossed my mind. And I'll take my share of the blame for that.
Another nationwide reporter dispatched to cover a charity walk was Bob Langley. On 2 occasions, he spotted young girls coming out of Savile's caravan.
They would be, I would say 12 or 13. They could have been 14. They certainly were not 15. After they had gone, he indicated to me in a nudge-nudge, wink-wink sort of way that he had just had sex with them. I didn't believe him. I said something like, thinking it was a joke, I said something like, I think they're a little bit on the young side for you, Jimmy. To which he replied, and I can't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, when you think that way, you're finished.
Since the ITV revelations, Bob has wondered whether he should have reported what he saw.
Supposing I had gone to the police or to the BBC, what would have happened? The answer is nothing would have happened. He would have said it was a joke. Can't you take a joke? And that would have been it.
If nationwide journalists didn't think to report Savile to their bosses, what about BBC staff who worked on another of his nomadic shows?
Back home again with today's edition of Savile's Travels. The atmosphere as this enormous boat shoots down this 1-in-4 ramp.
They went round the country in the caravan and obviously other things like a BBC car, and they'd stop and say to people, what's your favourite record? We'll play it for you.
Listen, how about on the radio we shall play you a nice piece of music? What sort of music would you like? Oh, good Welsh.
Paul Gambaccini worked in the office next door to Savile's Travels production base in Radio 1's London HQ. The programme's production assistants told him some disturbing stories.
They would come back from these Savile's Travels outings and they would report that unpleasantness had occurred.
What sort of unpleasantness?
We were told that he would go off with a institutionalized young woman.
A senior Savile's Travels member of staff even gossiped openly about their star's illegal behaviour.
I'm sure he regrets it now. He had a big mouth and would talk to the record company promotion people about things that went on in the caravan. So you see that there was no real attempt to cover up the fact that things did go on.
Again, though, he never thought to report Savile.
So what? I, a junior DJ, am supposed to get up there and say, my senior's a perv? They're going to laugh at me. It never occurred to me.
But word about what was happening on Savile's Travels was reaching BBC radio management. In 1973, the then Radio 1 controller, Douglas Muggeridge, ordered his press officer, Rodney Collins, to find out if the stories were true.
Douglas Muggeridge said to me, look, I've heard rumours about Jimmy Savile and perhaps some problems with underage girls. Do you know anything about this? And I said, I've heard nothing, Douglas, nothing at all.
Rodney Collins asked around his Fleet Street contacts to see if they had heard anything he could feed back to his boss.
They all came back with exactly the same answer. I mean, exactly, which was that they'd heard rumours about Jimmy Savile, but they knew of nothing. They knew of no inquiries going on by their newspapers, and they'd certainly not heard of any police interest.
Around the same time, Derek Chinnery, then a Radio 1 department head, was asked by Douglas Muggeridge to confront Savile with the allegations. An informal meeting was set up, with executive producer Doreen Davis acting as a witness. Savile flatly denied having sex with underage girls.
On reflection, it was very naive of Muggeridge and me to do that, because the man was obviously going to deny it, even though we had no real concrete evidence to prove that anything was up. If the man's denied it, you don't then go and hound him at the time. I know it sounds terrible that we didn't, but there was no reason to do so at the time.
Ah, wonderful, wonderful. So marvellous to get away from it all, ladies and gentlemen. Here we
It was an opportunity lost, a chance for the BBC to stop Savile's abuse almost 40 years ago.
I suppose this probably wasn't the BBC's finest hour. We only have to look at the press, television and radio over the last 3-4 weeks to see that.
Derek, God bless him, being on the 4th floor rather than on the 3rd floor. And that's the only difference it requires. He wouldn't have heard the plaintive cries of the disappointed program assistants on the 3rd floor. It's probably that simple, you know. It's just one floor in an office building makes all the difference in the world.
Any doubts about Savile's record during his radio days were soon forgotten as his television career took off. The BBC bought into Savile's sexually suggestive style in a big way.
Now then, if I was a chimpanzee and I was being naughty, what would you do to me? Say I was going like this, you see. Now then, what would you do if a chimpanzee was doing that? See these young ladies here?
His new television producer had no idea that anything but playfulness might lie behind it.
Now then, watch this. Get this, Dr. Camera. One click every trip. Now, of course, we can't have...
He'd never been told about the earlier radio inquiry.
I should have been told, I think.
The people who had felt that to be the case in BBC Radio should have perhaps passed it on to the television, but life's like that. You're in a hurry, you're making a programme, you get on with it. You know, Jimmy Savile was our brand name. He was the front man. He was very little involved in the making of the programme.
Why was it that you didn't discuss these rumours with anybody else in Television Centre at the time?
I don't know why it wasn't. You know, the questions you're asking me don't apply to what was going on in radio at the time, but they certainly apply to what was going on in television, apparently. But even that's only come to light in recent time, rather than 30 or 40 years ago.
Among the guests on Clunk Click were young people from hospitals and other institutions, including girls from Duncroft. Karen Ward, aged just 14, was one of them. After the show, she was invited with other young people to join more famous guests in the dressing rooms. She told Newsnight about this 11 months ago in the interview that was dropped.
What sort of things happened in Jimmy Savile's dressing room?
That's when the other guests on the show would come in, generally after the show had finished. They would come in and they clearly saw girls and, well, kids, male and female, as being there to be used. I had a famous person who would try. He smelled awful. He smelled of sweat and alcohol, and it made me heave just to be near him, so I certainly didn't want him to do anything to me.
Gary Glitter also appeared on Clunk Click. He too would join Jimmy Savile and his young guests in the dressing rooms after the show. They couldn't fail to be impressed.
I'm going to do a quick check on our beanbags. Did you like Gary's new record? Put your hand up if you like Gary's new record.
And all of us, of course, totally overawed by the fact that we were meeting all these famous people, and obviously that particular famous person wanted to have sex with one of the girls, and I suppose we would have seen it as some kind of honour, conquest, I don't know. I could remember being quite scared, actually, because I didn't like Gary Glitter. He gave me the creeps.
Put the tea down, kid.
Gary Glitter is now a convicted child sex offender, but he denies these new allegations.
Now then.
In the studio, some of the young guests came from the secure hospital Broadmoor.
Get yourselves there like that. Just put yourself in there.
Oh, lovely.
I get two. You get two. In there. Oh. I should be giving girls away. Lessons savers. I'm going to get some down here. We've got them here from Broadmoor. We've got them from all over here.
Savile's charity fundraising, he's said to have raised more than £40 million, gave him special access to many institutions and to vulnerable children.
See you next week for another Clunk Click. Ho-hoy!
I think his choice of victims is very interesting, isn't it? Who's going to take the word of a girl who's been in trouble with the law, who's found herself in an approved school, over somebody who has just, a few years earlier has been made an OBE because of his relentless charity work, who's one of the biggest TV stars in the country and is moving his way into the centre of the establishment by this point.
Savile's charity work took him inside the spinal injuries unit of Stoke Mandeville Hospital, Leeds General Hospital, where he worked as a porter, and, more remarkably, into high-security Broadmoor. There are now allegations and inquiries in them all. One former Broadmoor patient, Alison Pink, spent more than 20 years in mental hospitals after committing arson. She's since undergone a sex change.
He used to just suddenly appear, and he'd be smoking a cigar, having a cup of tea in the tea room, sitting in the corner talking to other female patients. And of course, once he got his keys, he was always doing that. I did actually sit there and think, he's a DJ, what's going on? But he did try and raise the profile of Broadmoor, give it a kinder looking face to the public, because they did songs of praise from Broadmoor. They did a programme called Inside Broadmoor.
Alison was then in her late teens, a patient locked in a secure hospital, but vulnerable to Jimmy Savile.
I was sitting on the sofa watching Top of the Pops, and Top of the Pops had already started. And as I said, he was sitting on the floor to this side of me, which would be my right. And he turned slightly, and then, as I said, he quite literally just put his hand between my legs, quickly, not really looking at me. And I remember moving backwards slightly, but I couldn't do anything about it. But there were two witnesses, two patients. We knew that if we stood up and said, look what he's doing, we'd be punished because they wouldn't believe us.
Those organisations that trusted Jimmy Savile as a fundraiser or simply as a friendly face could now pay a high price.
It's growing by the minute. Initially it was a few and now they're coming in all the time. The stories that I'm hearing from some of the victims are that they did report the abuse and that no action was taken.
The BBC could be the target of many legal claims. It was through the corporation that Savile came into contact with thousands of young people.
Welcome, another edition of Top of the Pops. Lots of nice young ladies about with us this evening, and lots of nice records we've got. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off.
There are now allegations that Top of the Pops was a centre for abuse, and that as well as Jimmy Savile, others were involved.
A group of 3 have been described, men in their 30s, who would collect girls from the Top of the Pops audience and take them to other parties off the premises of the BBC. And inappropriate things have been described as happening then, some quite serious.
And is it your understanding that these people worked for the BBC?
Yes. So, we've had one particular call that has names of people who can be traced on that, and that will be passed on to the police.
Not all of the victims were young girls. Lawyers are now hearing allegations that boys were targeted too.
There's some quite serious allegations that there was a paedophile ring operating. So these are quite serious allegations.
A paedophile ring operating where? At the BBC?
Yes.
Involving other members of staff?
Yes.
One more time, Jim.
In 1972, Jimmy Savile added honour to stardom when he was awarded the OBE. 2 years later, he was sufficiently confident to hint at his darker side in his autobiography. In one story from the early 60s, Savile told how the police had asked him to look out for a runaway girl. He told them that if he found her, he would keep her overnight as a reward. And that's exactly what happened.
In his book, he says, at 11:30 the next morning, she was willingly presented to an astounded lady of the law. The officeress was dissuaded from bringing charges against me, but it was well known that were I to go, I would probably take half the station with me.
I mean, are you surprised that he was still employed by the BBC and writing this sort of stuff?
Well, I am surprised, but, it was a different culture at that time. A year later, after his autobiography, he started presenting Jim Will Fix It, which very quickly became, an iconic children's programme. Some of the stuff that he was writing in his autobiography does seem, wrong.
Despite all the rumours, all those young girls hanging around his dressing room, and now his own published revelations, Savile was not just still employed by the BBC, he was marked out for stardom in his biggest show so far.
The BBC decided, why not put it all on film, which is why we call it Jim Will Fix It.
Took off in the most amazing way, and we got figures that were sometimes up to 20 million viewers. And on several occasions, Jim Will Fix It was #1, beating Coronation Street and This Is Your Life.
We have many things we would like you to fix for us, but we think the best of our ideas is a milk float race.
It was family entertainment, and it mostly featured children. The idea was that Jimmy Savile would make their dreams come true. This daft suggestion was dreamt up by a Cub Scout group from East London.
It was just great fun, really, really good day. Also excited.
And we're going to be short on badges, and there's only one badge, so we've got one badge with a big long ribbon. It goes round everybody like this, you see. That goes round here like this, and round there like this, and it fastens you up.
I was then told that we was going to get a big badge for the whole cub group. I was a bit disappointed, but then straight away he asked me if I would like my own individual badge just for myself, and then obviously I said yeah.
One of the Cub Scouts, a 9-year-old called Kevin, was singled out by Savile.
Incidentally, I was led into one of the rooms, and it was like a small dressing room, very dingy. We went in and he closed the door, and then he asked me again, you know, did I want my badge, and I said yeah. Then that's when he put his hand on my knee and started touching me, and then at the same time he grabbed my hand and forced my hand on top of his trousers and made me sort of rub him.
Did you think about telling somebody then?
No, certainly not then.
Why not?
No, I was absolutely petrified.
Jimmy Savile's producer for more than 20 years has since retired and lives in France. He says he knew his former colleague as well as anyone, which was not very well at all. But he had no reason to suspect him of wrongdoing.
You do hear rumours about people, but nothing to make me suspicious. And I was never given cause to feel I ought to be doing anything because no one had ever complained to me, and I myself hadn't seen anything.
You are sat on my magic chair. Do you know if you sit on my magic chair, I could make you disappear?
Jimmy Savile had succeeded in hoodwinking a lot of people, including Margaret Thatcher, the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Vatican, the Honours Committee, the NHS, and hospitals up and down the country, and several police forces, and some members of BBC staff, including me.
Outside the BBC, though, rumours were being picked up by Fleet Street. But still, the story didn't come out.
I think the rest of the media has something to answer for here. If we're to believe what we're now told, a lot of the newspapers, a lot of the tabloid press had their own inquiries, their own investigations going on into the allegations against Jimmy Savile.
As long ago as 1994, the Sunday Mirror had tracked down 2 women who'd been at the Duncroft approved school, and they told reporters about the sexual abuse they'd suffered.
They were in awe of Savile's power as they saw it, the fear that they wouldn't be believed. So when it came to the crunch, they were too terrified to sign affidavits and face the going to court, which would have been inevitable because of the, one thing would be certain, that was Jimmy Savile would hire the best QCs and sue you to high heaven.
The tabloids made me, and if they want to break me, that's up to them. Except we won't go down without a fight. I'll take a few of them with me.
When Jimmy Savile died, these papers that now say they have been conducting their own investigations, they didn't run anything either. They also ran their own tributes to Jimmy Savile. I'm not trying to excuse the BBC not following this story up, but I do think the whole of the British media probably fell down on the job here.
When you get your own back...
Right to the end, Savile was fending off questions about his private life, not always with a joke.
What do you do in the caravan?
Anybody I can lay my hands on. It's easy for me as a single man to say, I don't like children, because that puts a lot of salacious tabloid people off the hunt.
Are you basically saying that so tabloids don't, pursue this whole isn't he a paedophile line, basically?
Yes. Oh, aye. How do they know whether I am or not? How does anybody know whether I am? Nobody knows whether I am or not. I know I'm not. So I can tell you from experience that the easy way of doing it, when they say, oh, you have all them children, Jim will fix it. I say, yeah, I hate them.
There was one final chance to unmask Savile while he was still alive. Surrey police had investigated him in 2007, but it didn't get very far.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
In the end, the truth about Jimmy Savile never came out during his lifetime. But just a month after his death, the Newsnight team felt they were getting close to proving it. And then they found out about the Surrey police investigation.
When finally we got initially off-the-record confirmation that Surrey police had investigated Jimmy Savile, we just thought, we're over the line. We can now tell the story. And certainly our editor was very positive. He said basically all systems go. Let's get ready to get this story on air.
In an email on November the 25th, Peter Rippon wrote, "Excellent, we can pull together a TX plan. In other words, prepare for broadcast."
So there was no doubt in your mind that it was a definite commission?
Well, yes, absolutely.
By this time, the team were already aware their programme could result in a potentially embarrassing clash in the BBC's schedules in the run-up to Christmas.
We heard, I think on the PM programme, that the BBC was going to broadcast tributes to Jimmy Savile over Christmas, and there was deep intake of breath from all of us. We assumed that if our programme went ahead, they'd have to pull the tributes.
You think you'd made that connection at that point?
Oh, immediately, yes.
The two couldn't coexist?
No way.
So, while one part of the BBC was preparing to eulogise Savile the celebrity, another was preparing to expose him as a sexual predator. It was a tricky position for the Newsnight editor, Peter Rippon.
A lot of people think the BBC is this great monolith where the Director General sits at the top and everything he, or at some point in the future, no doubt she says goes. It really isn't like that. One of the most important things in the BBC is the editorial independence of its programme editors.
Given the potent issues involved, it was flagged up to Peter Rippon's bosses, Deputy Director of News Stephen Mitchell and Director of News Helen Bowden. For the Newsnight team, everything was going to plan. They worked on their script and on the 29th of November sent a copy to the editor. It included transcribed clips from Karen Ward's interview, naming Savile and Gary Glitter as being involved in the sexual abuse of underage girls, in one case on BBC premises. Their draft script also quoted 3 other unnamed Duncroft pupils who said they were abused by Savile, and a report of sexual assault at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. It all led a journalist from the BBC's in-house publicity team to tell Peter Rippon they anticipated a huge amount of interest and that all domestic outlets would want to run the story. The very next day, though, the 30th of November, the Newsnight editor suddenly applied the brakes.
All I can say is that it was an abrupt change of tone from, one day, excellent, let's prepare to get this thing on air, to, hold on.
His reason? Some of the women spoken to by the Newsnight team had claimed they'd been told by the Crown Prosecution Service it had not pressed charges because Savile was too old and frail. For Peter Rippon, getting confirmation of this became critical.
Having pondered this overnight, I think the key is whether we can establish the CPS did drop the case for the reasons the women say. That makes it a much better story. Our sources so far are just the women and a second-hand briefing.
We understand that he had concerns about the reliability of witnesses, including Karen Ward.
We were in an approved school. This is a school for bad girls. Who's going to believe bad girls when they say, oh, this happened to me, or he did that to me? No one would believe you. Just for the very nature that you were troubled. Duncroft was a school for intelligent but emotionally disturbed girls, which says it all. And it also says very loudly that Savile went after very, very vulnerable people.
But for editors of programmes like Newsnight, the reliability of witnesses may not be their only concern. How institutions like the police or the Crown Prosecution Service handle cases is also important.
One can criticise this all one likes, but a BBC editor with a kind of BBC mindset says, hang on a minute, if we've got a story here about an institution that's failed, then that, in our terms, a serious news and current affairs programme, that's a better story than the allegations alone.
But no one seems to have considered that the long-term abuse by a BBC personality, sometimes on BBC premises, was arguably the biggest institutional failure of them all. Newsnight's editor was instead focusing primarily on the Crown Prosecution Service. His team felt this was an unnecessary obstacle.
I was very surprised at this. I argued, as did Liz McKean, with our editor. We had meetings together, we had individual meetings with him, and the argument went on for some time.
The next day, Peter Rippon became even more adamant about the importance of the CPS outcome.
I assume still no word? I think we should stop working on the other elements, because we don't really have a strong enough story without it.
Having effectively told them to stop gathering new evidence against Savile, he then cancelled the editing of the piece.
I'll pull editing, etc. for now.
Did there seem to be any room for changing his mind once his mind had been made up?
No, it felt like there'd been a decision to kill the story.
6 days later, the BBC press office asked Peter Rippon how publicity for the story should be handled. Peter Rippon was blunt.
We are putting the cart way before the horse here. We've been looking at the story, but it is far from clear it will ever be strong enough for us even to run it.
He copied in his immediate boss, Stephen Mitchell, the Deputy Director of News.
So in 13 days, Peter Rippon had gone from excellent, prepared to broadcast, to this story isn't strong enough.
And we now know that he hadn't watched the interview with Karen Ward, the first person to go on camera testifying to Savile's abuse.
At no time did he say, I want to see everything and I'll come to a view on it. We did prepare and give him one of the drafts of the script so that he could see, which we'd made as full as we possibly could, with quotes that we already had, with transcripts of interviews that we already had, and also with stuff that we knew we were going to get. And we gave that to him so that, to try and impress upon him that we thought we had the story.
The producer emailed his editor, warning him of the potential for disaster if he dropped the film.
I was sure the story would come out one way or another, and that if it did, the BBC would be accused of a cover-up. In fact, I wrote an email to Peter saying the story is strong enough, and the danger of not running it is substantial damage to BBC reputation.
2 days later, the CPS told the team it had decided in 2009 not to prosecute Savile because of lack of evidence, not because he was old and frail. Peter Rippon killed the story.
I was very unhappy the story didn't run because I felt we'd spoken to people who collectively deserved to be heard. They weren't heard, and I thought that that was a failure.
Were you concerned that that actually compounded the hurt?
Yes, I felt we had a responsibility towards them. We'd got them to talk to us, but above all, we did believe them. And so then, for their stories not to be heard, yes, I felt very bad about that. I felt very much that I'd let them down.
Was it the right editorial call? A lot of people will have a different view about that.
What do you think?
Well, I think with hindsight, I might have made a different call, but I do fully understand why Peter made the call that he did.
As predicted, news emerged that the Savile story had been spiked. In January, cover-up was suggested. In February, that it had been pulled to protect the corporation's image. The BBC publicly denied it. Peter Rippon said it was absolutely untrue that the Newsnight investigation was dropped for anything other than editorial reasons. The Jimmy Savile story finally exploded back into life 3 weeks ago on ITV's Exposure. It's been the scoop of the year.
Detectives will be investigating events at locations across the country. At the BBC
investigation says 5 women have come forward with allegations.
Related to Savile's activities. She says she has no memory of that.
Under 16 at the time.
is pursuing 120 separate lines of inquiry.
And the chorus of voices demanding to know why the BBC had not run the story last year grew ever louder. To begin with, the BBC held firm. Savile's abuse was a matter for the police and there could be no inquiry at the corporation in case it got in the way. But that would soon change.
And do you think we'll see any resignations at the BBC over this?
It's been a baptism of fire for the new Director General, George Entwistle. He's apologised to Savile's victims.
I have one thing to repeat. That is a profound and heartfelt apology on behalf of the BBC to every victim.
And he announced a number of inquiries.
These will be forensic, but also soul-searching examinations. Our audience's trust in us is paramount. We will do everything in our power to maintain that trust.
But there remain a number of key questions about the BBC's handling of the Savile crisis. The first, why didn't they run their story based on the evidence they had?
In a blog, the Newsnight editor explained his reasons for cancelling the investigation.
Newsnight is not normally interested in celebrity expose. I felt if we could prove the police or the CPS had let the women down in some way, we should go ahead.
But the Newsnight producer remains adamant that was not his initial brief.
I thought the story was about Jimmy Savile, paedophile, and I thought that was a strong enough story to run.
Is it possible that you misunderstood what your editor wanted, or that maybe you just didn't keep him up to date with all the developments in your investigation?
It's possible, but I think once you've got the story that Jimmy Savile is a paedophile, you've got a victim on camera, you've got corroboration from other witnesses and victims, when you've got confirmation for the first time that Savile was investigated by the police as a paedophile, I think you've got a great story, and I think any journalist would run that.
The Director General, George Entwistle, sent an email to all staff giving the official BBC line that Newsnight were investigating how Surrey police had handled their Savile investigation.
As is now well known, the BBC Newsnight programme investigated Surrey Police's inquiry into Jimmy Savile towards the end of 2011, but decided not to go ahead with the broadcast.
But Panorama has seen internal emails which appear to question the BBC's official version of events. One was sent by the Newsnight producer, telling the Director General that he was wrong.
George, one note. The investigation was into whether Jimmy Savile was a paedophile. I know because it was my investigation.
BBC's perspective. You've done a lot.
Yet the very next day, an interview with the corporation's head of editorial policy and standards was broadcast, in which it was said again.
Well, they're investigating the Surrey Police investigation into Jimmy Savile, and they discovered that the Surrey Police had done a perfectly decent investigation into Jimmy Savile, had made recommendations to the Crown Prosecution Service, and then subsequently it had been dropped because they felt there was a lack of evidence. Now, you know,
I felt they were misleading at the very least. I think they were suggesting that the story wasn't about the thing that had been commissioned, which was allegations about Jimmy Savile's behaviour to teenage girls. It seemed to give a misleading impression. And overall, I just felt, well, once again, it's like their stories are being minimised.
And the team had more direct evidence of abuse at Duncroft than they had been told the police and the CPS had originally considered.
The CPS had only looked at one allegation of indecent assault investigated by Surrey Police. But 4 years on, Newsnight had spoken to 5 former pupils who said they'd been sexually abused at Duncroft. So what happened to Newsnight's evidence once the story was dropped?
That's problem number 2. Should the evidence have been handed to the police? In his blog, Peter Rippon said,
"We are confident that all the women we spoke to had contacted the police independently already."
But this wasn't correct.
The key witness, Karen Ward, categorically told us that she'd not gone to the police, and Peter was reminded many times that that was the case, both verbally and in writing.
So you had made him aware of that?
Yes, and we did so again, myself and Liz McKean, after he wrote the blog.
So you actually pointed out this inaccuracy?
Yes, of course.
And it wasn't changed?
Not as far as I know.
Peter Rippon's team emailed him, telling him he'd got it wrong. He says that's what he'd been told. In his blog, he adds,
"We also had no new evidence against any other person that would have helped the police."
But they did. Remember, Karen Ward had said she saw Gary Glitter having sex with an underage girl in Jimmy Savile's dressing room at Television Centre. Shouldn't that have been passed to the police? The team didn't think so, and for once, they were all in agreement.
I don't think we withheld anything that would have been much use, evidentially, to the police. Jimmy Savile was dead and could not be prosecuted. In our interview, Karen Ward said she didn't know who Gary Glitter was having sex with in a BBC dressing room. So it's very limited use. But yes, maybe the decision should have been taken to pass it on.
A source close to the Surrey police investigation has told Panorama that they weren't aware of the Gary Glitter allegation back in 2007. It's new information. And the fact that it's an allegation about a living person makes it all the more serious.
Since being interviewed for ITV, Karen Ward has spoken to police. The police are now investigating people still living connected to Savile's crimes, including, we understand, Gary Glitter.
A few days afterwards, I was contacted by officers from the Met, and they came to my house, and they did 9.5 hours of interviews and statements with me. And at no point did they say, "I don't believe you," or "That's not right."
Now there's a third problem for the BBC, which has dogged it since this controversy erupted. Did the Newsnight editor take the decision to stop the investigation on his own, as the BBC's maintained, or was he subject to pressure from above? There's been widespread speculation outside the BBC that the Newsnight investigation was shelved because of the big tribute programmes already commissioned to celebrate Jimmy Savile's life.
I've spoken to a number of people at all levels in the BBC, and a lot of people will have to be lying for it to be true that pressure was put on Peter Rippon to pull that film. And I don't believe they are.
Panorama has found no evidence that Peter Rippon was told to drop the story, but it's difficult to explain why he went off it so quickly. During their rows about it, Liz McKean says she was left with the clear impression that Peter Rippon was feeling the heat.
On the morning of the 30th of November, I fire off this email to a friend saying, you know, PR says if the bosses aren't happy, I can't go to the wall on this one.
And the final big question, what did the new Director General know then? In the top job for just 4 weeks, when the Newsnight investigation was dropped, he was head of BBC Vision, in charge of TV output. Which means he was ultimately responsible for those tribute films.
So, for the first time in 17 years, it's time for a letter.
How much did George Entwistle know about the Newsnight investigation, which threatened his Christmas schedule?
Because she wrote.
We understand that at an awards ceremony here on December the 2nd last year, the Director of News, Helen Bowden, told George Entwistle that if the Newsnight investigation went ahead, he might have to change his Christmas schedule. We're told the whole conversation lasted less than 10 seconds.
She didn't give me any more information than to say that it's something Newsnight were looking at, and I said, thank you for letting me know.
So, in a 10-second meeting, the Director of News doesn't offer any detail, and the Director of Vision doesn't ask any questions.
The thing that was uppermost in my mind was an absolute determination to ensure that nobody should construe anything I had to say or think about this as a matter of any pressure. So Helen said to me, we're looking into Jimmy Savile, and I said, thanks for letting me know. I hope you'll keep me updated.
I think this might be a problem that George Entwistle has, that for all the right reasons he did the wrong thing. in trying to appear to do this at arm's length, to not interfere, to not have any influence over what was going on in news, he probably stepped a little too far back. And I think he did that. I think he did that for good reasons. Well, I think he did it for good reasons.
Tomorrow, the Director-General will face questions from MPs on the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee.
He is there to account for the BBC, but actually he did hold one of the key positions at the time some of these decisions were taken. So yes, obviously we will be asking him about what his knowledge was at that time, whether or not he did play any part in the decisions that were taken, and why perhaps he didn't ask as many questions as some people think he should have done.
This is exactly why the BBC can't possibly win on this. Because if it's shown that George did in fact ask all these questions, then interference pressure. If it's shown that he didn't, then, you know, it's top BBC man asleep at the wheel.
We put the points we've raised to all the BBC senior management involved and asked for interviews. They declined. In a statement, the BBC said today it was
putting first and foremost the victims of Jimmy Savile's abuse.
And that's why it's announced a judge-led review. They added that a second independent review, which will seek to establish what exactly happened at Newsnight, is
the right forum to resolve detailed issues
relating to the programme. The BBC admitted there were inaccuracies in Peter Rippon's blog on October the 2nd and have now corrected them, stating that they accepted there were
allegations of abusive conduct on BBC premises
and, in some cases, the women Newsnight had contacted
had not spoken to the police,
and that
the police were not aware of all the allegations.
The BBC accepted there were allegations that
some of the Duncroft staff knew or may have known about the abuse.
It added,
we should also make it clear we now accept that the Newsnight investigation did not start out as an investigation into the Surrey Police's handling of the case against Mr. Savile.
Newsnight editor Peter Rippon is stepping aside while the investigation into what happened at Newsnight is carried out.
Do you think all of this could have been avoided?
Very easily by broadcasting a very good story about Sir Jimmy Savile and how he was a paedophile. That would have avoided all of this.
Top groups, top records, top everything.
Jimmy Savile, the Star, was the BBC's creation. For half a century, it, more than any other organisation, failed to face up to an unpalatable truth.
Give us a guess,
He fooled them or pulled the wool over their eyes. He managed to get them all to look the other way, even though almost every one of them would have heard rumours, and he was hiding in plain sight.
The Metropolitan Police say they're investigating allegations from more than 200 potential victims of the late presenter and others. The Met have confirmed some of the alleged abusers are still alive. Panorama will give the police any new evidence we've uncovered. And the woman who revealed that story to the Newsnight team, yet went unheard, is at last being listened to.
I think being believed might end up being a good feeling. At the moment it's not so good because I don't really know how to cope with it. But one day I will, and then it will be good.
This is the worst crisis that I can remember in my nearly 50 years at the BBC. I don't think the BBC has handled it terribly well. All we have as an organisation is the trust of people, the people that watch us and listen to us. And if we don't have that, if we start to lose that, that's very dangerous for the BBC.
There's no doubt trust in the corporation has been badly shaken by the decision to halt the investigation into Savile. But it's the decision to run tributes celebrating the Star, when all the while his victims were trying to be heard, that may yet haunt the BBC for years to come.